For 60 years, an old woman lived locked inside a Belgian castle, and every single day she believed she was still an empress. She gave orders to servants who weren't there. She set a place at dinner for a husband who had been shot by a firing squad half a century earlier. Nobody ever told her the truth. The world had forgotten she was even alive. Her name was Carlotta, and we'll come back to her, because what happened to her is the cruelest version of something that happened to a lot of women. And it's far worse than simply being forgotten after you die. Because we all get forgotten eventually. That's ordinary. That's just time. What happened to these women is something else. They were erased while they were still breathing. Locked away, declared mad, replaced, divorced into silence, shut behind stone walls and told the world outside had moved on without them, and then forced to keep living, sometimes for decades, inside that erasure. Wives who became ghosts before they were corpses. Queens the world buried while their hearts were still beating. I want to start with the youngest of them, because she barely got to live at all. She was a 15-year-old English girl when they shipped her off to marry a king she had never met. And by 23, she was dead in a foreign castle, cut off from her own children forever. Her name was Caroline Matilda, and she was born in London in 1751 into the British royal family, a granddaughter of one king and the sister of another, the future George III. She was, by all accounts, a warm, lively, slightly wild young girl who loved riding and singing and the outdoors. And then, at 15, she was handed to Denmark. Royal marriages were treaties, and Caroline Matilda was the price of one. She was married by proxy, meaning she wasn't even in the same country as her groom for the actual wedding ceremony. To King Christian VII of Denmark, her own first cousin, a boy of 17. She crossed the sea weeping and arrived in a court that spoke a language she barely knew to marry a stranger. And the stranger, it turned out, was deeply, dangerously unwell. Christian VII is one of the most tragic figures ever to sit on a throne. Today, historians believe he suffered from a severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia. He was prone to hallucinations, violent outbursts, and long periods where he simply wasn't present in any normal sense. He told people he couldn't love Caroline Matilda because it was unfashionable to love one's wife. He humiliated her, neglected her, and disappeared into his own deteriorating mind. She was a teenage girl, alone in a foreign country, married to a man who was losing his grip on reality. She did her duty. She produced an heir, a son. And then she found the one thing her marriage had never given her, someone who actually cared about her. His name was Johann Friedrich Struensee, and he was the king's personal physician, a brilliant, ambitious German doctor who had been brought in to manage Christian's illness. Struensee could handle the king. He was calm with him, and Christian came to trust him completely. So completely that Struensee began, in effect, to rule Denmark through him. He got the king to sign whatever he put in front of him, and for a period of about a year and a half, this commoner doctor was the most powerful man in the country, pushing through a flood of radical Enlightenment reforms. And he and the lonely young queen fell in love. It wasn't even particularly hidden. Caroline Matilda, starved of affection for years, threw herself into the relationship. In 1771, she gave birth to a daughter, Louise Augusta, a girl the whole court quietly assumed was Struensee's child, not the king's. It couldn't last, and it didn't. In January 1772, at a masked ball, the conspiracy struck. A faction led by the king's stepmother moved against them. Struensee was arrested. Caroline Matilda was arrested. The doctor was put on trial, tortured, and then subjected to one of the most horrific public executions of the century. His hand cut off, then his head, then his body broken and displayed on a wheel in front of a crowd of tens of thousands. And Caroline Matilda, the Queen of Denmark, 20 years old, was divorced, stripped of her crown, and taken away. Her brother, King George III, negotiated to save her from a lifetime in a grim Danish fortress. But the deal came with a devastating condition. She was to be exiled to Celle Castle in the German territory of Hanover, and she had to leave her children behind. Both of them. Her son, the heir, stayed in Denmark, and she begged specifically to be allowed to keep her baby daughter, arguing that the little girl had no real connection to the Danish crown. They refused even that. The 10-month-old was taken from her. She never saw either of her children again. She lived at Celle for 3 years. She had a small court, a library, a little theater. She gave money to orphans and poor children. And she waited because she genuinely believed this was temporary, that one day she would be restored, that she would return to Denmark and rule as regent for her son. She made plans. She kept herself ready. And then, in May 1775, scarlet fever swept through the town, and Caroline Matilda caught it, and within days, she was dead. She was 23 years old. She died in the wrong country, exiled, divorced, erased from the Danish court as though she had never existed, forbidden to see her own son and daughter, still waiting for a homecoming that was never going to come. Her children grew up barely knowing they had ever had a mother. She had been a queen for 6 years and a ghost for 3, and she didn't live long enough to be anything else. Caroline Matilda, at least, had 6 years of being a real queen before the walls closed in. The next woman didn't even get 6 days. She was abandoned by her husband before the wedding celebrations were finished, and then spent the rest of her short life being moved from prison to prison until he had her killed. Her name was Blanche of Bourbon, and she was a French princess, a niece of the King of France, and in 1353, at the age of 14, she was sent to Castile in Spain to marry its young king, Pedro I, the man history would come to call Pedro the Cruel. The marriage was a grand political alliance between France and Castile, sealed with treaties and an enormous promised dowry. Blanche arrived, a teenager in a foreign land, and the wedding was celebrated at Valladolid with all the pomp a royal union demanded. And 2 days later, Pedro got on his horse and rode away. He rode straight back to the woman he actually loved, a Castilian noblewoman named Maria de Padilla, whom he may already have secretly married before Blanche ever arrived, and who he would stay devoted to for the rest of his life. Blanche, the 14-year-old bride, had been a diplomatic obligation, and the moment the ceremony was done, he discarded her like a signed document filed away in a drawer. But he couldn't simply send her home. That would insult France and unravel the alliance. So he did something colder. He locked her up. Blanche spent essentially her entire married life as a prisoner. She was moved from fortress to fortress, Toledo, Arevalo, Sigüenza, a queen of Castile who never got to be a wife, never got to rule, never got anything but a succession of stone rooms. Her French relatives barely lifted a finger. Her cousin, the King of France, did at least appeal to the Pope to excommunicate Pedro for imprisoning her, and the Pope refused to get involved. So there she stayed, a bargaining chip nobody was bargaining for, growing from a girl into a young woman inside a series of prisons. Notice the detail that gives it away. Over the years, they kept moving her further and further south, deeper into Castile, away from the French border, specifically to make it harder for anyone to rescue her. She was being deliberately buried, geographically, where no one could reach her. Finally, in 1361, after around 8 years of captivity, Blanche was being held at Medina Sidonia, far in the south. And there, her keeper was reportedly given an order from the king: kill her. Exactly how she died is still argued about. One version says a crossbowman shot her on Pedro's command. Another says she was poisoned. His defenders claimed illness, but the timing was suspicious, and the chroniclers of the age, and history ever since, largely concluded that Pedro the Cruel had his young wife murdered. She was somewhere between 22 and 25 years old. Here's the line that says it all. Blanche of Bourbon was Queen of Castile for 8 years, and she is almost entirely forgotten by history. She never held power, never had children, never sat a court, never did a single thing a queen is remembered for, because she was never allowed to. She was a title in a treaty and a prisoner in a tower, and then she was a quiet murder in a southern fortress. And then she was nothing at all, forgotten before she died and forgotten completely after. Blanche was erased by a husband who never wanted her. The next woman was erased in almost exactly the same way, locked in a castle for a love affair. But her erasure came with a twist so strange, it's hard to believe it's true. Her name was Sophia Dorothea, and she spent 30 years locked in a castle for a love affair, and became, without ever knowing it, a queen of a country she was never allowed to enter. And here's a haunting coincidence. She was imprisoned in the very same town, Celle, where Caroline Matilda would later be exiled to die. That small German town held 2 forgotten queens, a century apart, each erased for loving the wrong man. She was born in 1666, in that same town of Celle, and she grew up happy, genuinely, warmly loved, the cherished only daughter of a duke. And then, at 16, she was married off for political reasons to her cousin, George Louis of Hanover. He was cold and distant and unfaithful, and his family looked down on her. His mother despised her, and George Louis himself soon came to share that contempt, carrying on openly with a mistress while treating his young wife with indifference bordering on cruelty. Sophia Dorothea was trapped in a loveless marriage in a court that didn't want her, and she did the same thing Caroline Matilda would do generations later. She found someone who loved her. His name was Count Philipp Christoph von Königsmarck, a dashing Swedish soldier and an old childhood acquaintance. They fell into a passionate affair, and they wrote each other hundreds of letters. Historians count something like 340 from him, 320 from her, burning, desperate letters, plotting to run away together and start a new life. They never got the chance. One night in July 1694, after visiting Sophia Dorothea's rooms, Count Königsmarck vanished. He simply disappeared and was never seen again. What almost certainly happened is that he was ambushed and murdered inside the palace on the orders of someone in the Hanoverian court, possibly George Louis's own father. And then his body was made to disappear completely. The most enduring account is that his corpse was buried under the floorboards of a palace corridor and covered in quicklime to dissolve it faster. Years later, several people involved reportedly confessed on their deathbeds to the killing. The body has never been found. The letters were seized and largely destroyed. And Sophia Dorothea was divorced, accused of desertion, and sent to a remote moated castle called Alden, out in the flat, lonely, forested countryside. She was 28 years old. She would stay there for the rest of her life, 30+ years. Guarded around the clock by dozens of men. Her mail read, her visitors screened, her staff handpicked for their loyalty to the people imprisoning her. She was stripped of her title and given a new, lesser one, the Duchess of Alden. Her 2 children were taken and raised by the family that had locked her up, and she was forbidden to write to them or see them. Her only permitted visitor was her own mother. At first, she was confined so tightly she could only walk in the castle courtyard. Over the years, the leash loosened by inches. She was allowed into the gardens with an escort of guards and eventually permitted short, supervised drives outside the walls. Always watched, always returned. Her mother spent years petitioning kings and rulers across Europe to have her freed and got nowhere. And Sophia Dorothea, remarkably, never once tried to escape. Perhaps she'd given up. Perhaps, after what had happened to Königsmarck, she understood exactly what the people holding her were capable of. She simply lived quietly in a moated castle in the middle of a forest for 3 decades, growing from a young woman into an old one while the world forgot her. And those hundreds of love letters she and Königsmarck had written, the evidence of the affair that destroyed her, were confiscated by the Hanoverian court, and much of the surrounding correspondence was censored or destroyed, so that even the record of who she had been was deliberately thinned out. They didn't just imprison the woman. They went back and edited the paper trail of her life. Here's the staggering part. Her ex-husband, George Louis, the cold man who had imprisoned her, inherited the throne of Great Britain. In 1714, he sailed to London and became King George I, which meant that Sophia Dorothea, still legally alive, was technically the wife he had put away, and by rights, the Queen of Great Britain. She never set foot in Britain. She was never crowned. Her name was struck from the official prayers. It was, essentially, forbidden to speak of her at court. Her own son, who became King George II, grew up under a father who had erased his mother from existence. The British public barely knew she existed. There was a queen, alive, in a castle in Germany, and the kingdom she was queen of had no idea she was there. She lived in that castle until 1726, 32 years, and died still imprisoned at the age of 60. And there's a final chilling piece of the legend. It's said that before she died, she cursed her husband, swearing to meet him before God's judgment within a year. George I died about 7 months later, and when his body was being carried through Germany, the story goes, he was informed of her death, and the guilt or the shock helped bring on the stroke that killed him. She got 32 years in a moated castle for falling in love. Her lover got quicklime under the floorboards, and she died a queen that her own kingdom had never been allowed to know was alive. Both of those women were locked in castles. But there was another way to make a royal woman vanish, older and quieter, and for 1,000 years it was the tool of choice across the Christian world, the convent. You didn't have to kill an inconvenient queen or empress. You just had to put her behind the walls of a monastery, shave her head, wrap her in a nun's habit, and let everyone agree to forget she was ever a threat. And nowhere did they play this game more ruthlessly than in the Byzantine Empire. Consider two sisters, Zoe and Theodora, born to the imperial family of Constantinople around the turn of the first millennium. They were born in the purple, Porphyrogenita, the highest possible birth, daughters of an emperor. And for most of their lives, the men around them treated them as pieces to be shelved. Theodora got the convent. Her sister Zoe, jealous and grasping, had Theodora accused of conspiracy and shut away in a monastery, where she was left to rot in obscurity for around 13 years. A princess of the ruling house, erased into a nun, while her sister ran the empire into chaos through a string of husbands and a poisoning and an adopted son who turned on her. Then, in 1042, the people of Constantinople finally had enough of the disastrous men on the throne, and they rioted, and they demanded their true empresses back. And so a mob physically went to the convent, dragged the aging Theodora out of it. Reportedly against her own will, she'd made her peace with the quiet life, and forcibly dressed her in imperial robes and put her on the throne next to her sister. Two old women who had both been shelved and forgotten, suddenly hauled back into the light because the empire had run out of alternatives. They didn't even last long together before the rivalry flared and one was pushed aside again. But watch what happens at the very end of the story, because it's the purest example of the whole idea. Years later, the last of them, Theodora, had once more been eased out toward a monastery. And when the reigning emperor lay dying, his advisors schemed to pass the throne to an outsider rather than to her. And their reasoning, recorded at the time, was essentially that since she was tucked away in a convent, she wouldn't even know what was going on. She wouldn't notice she'd been skipped. She was so thoroughly erased in their minds that they assumed a living empress could simply be stepped over like a piece of furniture. That was the genius of the convent. It didn't just remove a woman. It made everyone, including the people plotting around her, genuinely stop thinking of her as real. And this is where it stops being a series of sad, individual stories and starts being something worse. Because this wasn't improvised. Civilization after civilization didn't just occasionally lock away an inconvenient royal woman. They built dedicated institutions for it, places whose entire purpose was to hold women who used to matter. And the Ottomans had the most efficient version of all, with a name so plain it's almost funny: the Old Palace. In Istanbul, the Sultan and his court lived at Topkapi, the new palace, the center of the world, where power was. And across the city stood the Eski Saray, the Old Palace. And the rule was simple and absolute. When a sultan died, the women of his household, his mother, his consorts, the mothers of his children, everyone whose status had depended on him, were packed up and moved there. Permanently. It was, as one description puts it, the retirement home for powerless dynastic women. You went in, and you did not come out, and the new regime got on with things without you. The woman whose fall shows you exactly what that meant was named Safiye Sultan. Safiye was born somewhere in the Balkans around 1550 and taken into the Ottoman harem as a slave girl in her early teens. And she rose through intelligence, nerve, and the enormous luck of bearing a son who lived, until she became one of the most powerful people in the 16th century world. When her son Mehmed became sultan, Safiye became Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning emperor, and she ran things. She controlled access, she directed patronage, and most remarkably, she conducted her own foreign policy, because foreign ambassadors worked out that the fastest route to Ottoman power ran through her and started writing to her directly instead of to the Sultan, including one particular foreign ruler. Because on the other side of Europe sat another woman running a country in a man's world, Queen Elizabeth I of England. And these two women, the Protestant queen of a small island kingdom and the slave-born mother of the Ottoman Sultan, became correspondents. They wrote to each other. They exchanged extraordinary gifts. Elizabeth sent Safiya her own portrait and a bejeweled clock organ and a European-style carriage so magnificent that conservative Ottoman courtiers were scandalized by Safiya riding around the city in it. Safiya sent back robes, jewels, and precious stones. And through those letters, Safiya helped smooth the trade privileges that let English merchants operate across the Ottoman world. Two of the most powerful women on the planet, writing to each other across religions and continents, quietly shaping international trade, while the men in both courts pretended the real business was happening somewhere else. And then, in 1603, Safiye's son died. That was it. That was the whole of her power, gone in a moment, because her authority had never been her own. It had been borrowed from a man's life. A new sultan meant a new sultan's mother. And Safiya Sultan, who had corresponded with Queen Elizabeth, who had directed the foreign policy of an empire spanning 3 continents, was moved across the city to the Old Palace. She lived there for roughly another 16 years and died there in obscurity around 1619. The most internationally connected woman in the Ottoman world spent her final years in the building the empire kept specifically for women who no longer counted. And it's not really the fact that it happened to her that gets me. It's that there was a building for it, that an empire looked at the question of what to do with women who had once held power, built the answer out of stone, and then used it generation after generation as routine administration. Those systems removed women quietly, bureaucratically, on paper. What happened next in the Chinese Imperial Palace was neither quiet nor bureaucratic. The West had its convents. Imperial China had something colder, and it even had a name for it, the Cold Palace. It wasn't one specific building so much as an idea, the neglected, sealed-off quarters where a fallen empress or a discarded concubine was sent to be forgotten. And what happened in one of those rooms in the 7th century, during the Tang Dynasty, is one of the most horrifying things in this entire story. The woman was Empress Wang, the wife of the Emperor Gaozong. She was high-born, she was the legitimate empress, and she made one catastrophic mistake. She was locked in a power struggle with a beautiful rival concubine, and to defeat that rival, Wang encouraged the emperor to bring another woman into the palace as a counterweight. That other woman was named Wu, and she would become Wu Zetian, the only woman in the whole of Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right, and one of the most ruthless political operators who ever lived. It was the worst decision Empress Wang ever made. She had invited in the person who would destroy her. Wu maneuvered brilliantly and mercilessly. By most accounts, when Wu gave birth to a daughter, the infant died, and Wu blamed the death on Empress Wang, who had recently visited the child. Whether it was a genuine tragedy Wu exploited or something darker, it worked. The emperor turned against his wife. In 655, Empress Wang was deposed on charges of witchcraft, stripped of everything, reduced to a commoner, and imprisoned deep in the palace, along with the very rival she'd once fought. The two enemies now locked away together, united at last by their shared destruction. And they were walled up. The accounts describe them sealed into a room with the doors and windows bricked over, leaving only a small hole through which food could be passed. A former empress of China, sealed into a chamber, like something being entombed alive. There's a scene, recorded in the histories, that is almost unbearable. The emperor, the man who had loved Wang once and loved her rival, happened to think of them one day and went to the sealed room and called out to them through the wall. "Empress," he called, "where are you?" And Wang, from inside her tomb, wept and answered that she was no longer an empress. She was a condemned criminal now and had no right to the name. She begged him, if he still had any feeling for her, to let them see the sun again, to name their prison the Court of Reborn Sunlight, so they might live to look at daylight once more. The emperor said he would do something. He left. And Wu Zetian, learning that her husband had gone to the sealed room and been moved by the sight of them, understood the danger instantly. If he weakened, they might come back. So she had them killed, and the way she reportedly did it is one of the most notorious atrocities in Chinese history. She had them beaten, their hands and feet cut off, and their mutilated bodies thrown into a vat of wine to die. A former empress of China, who had simply lost a palace rivalry, erased first into a bricked-up room and then out of existence entirely. Wu went on to rule the empire for decades. Empress Wang went into the ground with no honors and, for a long time, no name. That is the far end of what "forgotten before you died" could mean. Not a comfortable castle, a hole in a wall, and a voice calling through it, asking only to see the sun. The women erased in China and Byzantium were destroyed by rivals for power. The next was destroyed by the two people who should have protected her most, her own father and her own son. Her name was Juana, and history knows her by a cruel nickname, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. And she may be the most tragic figure in this entire story because she was almost certainly never mad at all. She was sane and inconvenient, and that turned out to be far more dangerous. Juana was born in 1479, a daughter of the two most powerful monarchs in Europe, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the rulers who united Spain and funded Columbus. She was intelligent, well-educated, fluent in several languages, and she was married off, as these women always were, for politics, to Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince, in a match designed to bind Spain and the Habsburg Empire together. And then something unusual happened. She fell wildly, obsessively in love with her own husband. Philip did not return it in kind. He was a serial philanderer, charming and faithless, and Juana's intense love for him curdled into fierce jealousy, which the men around her would later seize on as their first evidence that she was unstable. Because here was their problem. Through a series of deaths, her brother, her sister, her nephew, Juana unexpectedly became the heir to the throne of Castile. When her mother Isabella died in 1504, Juana was the rightful queen, in her own right, the actual, legitimate monarch of one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. And every powerful man around her decided that simply could not be allowed to stand. Her father Ferdinand wanted to keep ruling Castile himself. Her husband Philip wanted to rule it through her. Neither of them wanted Juana actually holding power, and so, between them, they began to build the story. She was too emotional, too unstable, too consumed by jealousy and grief, not fit to rule. The word mad started doing its quiet work. Then in 1506, Philip, the husband she adored, suddenly died, probably of typhoid, possibly, some whispered, of poison. And Juana's grief was genuinely overwhelming. And here the legend takes its most famous, Gothic turn. The stories say she refused to be parted from his embalmed body, that she had the coffin travel with her, that she opened it to gaze at him and kiss him, that she wouldn't let other women near it even in death, jealous of him still. How much of that is true, and how much was exaggerated by the men who needed her to look insane, we will never fully know. But it was exactly the ammunition they wanted. A grieving widow, clinging to a corpse. Perfect. There's one detail of that period that has fascinated and horrified people for 500 years. After Philip's death, Juana set out on a long, slow journey across Castile, accompanying his coffin, and the accounts describe a procession that traveled mostly by night. The grieving queen refusing to let the body be housed in any convent of nuns, reportedly out of jealousy, even now, unwilling to let other women be near him, even in death. She is said to have periodically had the coffin opened so she could look at him, touch him, be certain he was still there. Whether this was the raw, disordered grief of a woman who had loved a faithless man too much, or a deliberate act of a queen making a point about her devotion, or simply a story sharpened by her enemies, it became the founding legend of the Mad. A woman crossing Spain in the dark, behind a corpse. Her father moved fast. In 1509, Ferdinand confined his own daughter, the Queen of Castile, to a fortified palace in a town called Tordesillas. And there she stayed, for 46 years. Let that number sit for a second. 46 years, locked in a set of rooms, while her father, and then her son, ruled in her name. To keep her from leaving, her keepers reportedly told her there were plagues and dangers outside the walls. Her loyal servants were fired and replaced with jailers. When her father died, they didn't even tell her, because knowing might have given her a chance to claim her power back. She was not entirely alone in there, which somehow makes it worse. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, born just after Philip's death, was shut up in Tordesillas with her for years, a little girl growing up inside her mother's prison, the two of them clinging to each other in a set of rooms while the men outside ran a kingdom in the mother's name. Eventually, even Catherine was taken away, married off to become Queen of Portugal, and Juana lost the last companion she had. Her jailers were chillingly deliberate about her isolation. One of the men her son appointed to keep her, the Marquis of Denaya, worked to cut her off from any contact with the outside world at all, because contact meant the risk that someone might realize she was competent. He controlled what she knew, who she saw, what news reached her. She was, in the most literal sense, disappeared, while remaining on every official document as the reigning Queen of Castile. And here is the single most damning piece of evidence that Juana was never mad. In 1520, a rebellion swept Castile, the revolt of the Comuneros, and the rebels actually captured Tordesillas and freed her. For about 100 days, Juana was loose, and the rebels needed her to sign documents supporting their cause, which would have legitimized everything. And the people who met her, who sat and spoke with her during those 100 days, recorded that she was lucid, intelligent, reasonable, speaking, as the notarized accounts put it, with clear judgment. She wasn't raving. She was a rational woman who had been locked in a room for over a decade. There is a line from the man her son appointed to keep her imprisoned afterward that tells you the whole truth of it. He warned that Juana must not be allowed to speak freely with anybody, because, he wrote, she would convince anyone. That is not a description of a mad woman. That is a description of a sane queen so persuasive that her jailers were afraid of what would happen if people simply heard her talk. The rebellion was crushed. The doors closed again, and Juana went back into her rooms for another 35 years. By the end, after nearly half a century of isolation, some accounts suggest she really had deteriorated, that the endless confinement finally did to her mind what her family had always pretended was already there. If so, it's the cruelest irony of all. They called her mad to lock her away, and the locking away is what eventually broke her. She died in Tordesillas in 1555 at 75. Having been Queen of Castile for 49 years and having ruled for essentially none of them. Her son, who kept her imprisoned to the end, became the most powerful ruler in the world. And history remembered her not as the sane woman robbed of her crown by the men in her family, but by the name they gave her to justify it. La Loca, the Mad. She was forgotten before she died because being remembered would have meant admitting she was never mad in the first place. Juana's grief was used against her. The next woman weaponized her own grief and forgot the child who needed her. Her name was Maria Eleonora, and she was the Queen of Sweden, and her story is a strange, dark inversion of the others. A queen who erased herself. She was a German princess who married one of the greatest warrior kings in European history, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, the Lion of the North, a military genius who transformed his country into a great power. By most accounts, she loved him with an intensity that bordered on the unstable, and her moods and dramatics wore on a court that found her exhausting. In 1626, she gave birth to a daughter, Christina, the child who would become one of the most famous queens in Swedish history. But Maria Eleonora had desperately wanted a son, and she was, by the accounts of the time, cold and rejecting toward the little girl. The real catastrophe came in 1632, when Gustavus Adolphus was killed in battle at Lutzen, and Maria Eleonora's grief detonated into something monstrous. She refused to let him go. When his body was returned to Sweden, she kept the coffin with her and delayed the burial for months and months. And in the most disturbing detail of her story, she had her husband's heart removed, placed in a golden casket, and hung it above her bed, where she kept it. She plunged the court into a suffocating, theatrical mourning. Darkened rooms hung with black, the young Princess Christina pulled into her mother's bed beneath that dangling casket containing her dead father's heart. Her behavior became so extreme and her influence over the traumatized child so alarming that the Swedish government did something drastic. They separated mother and daughter. Christina was taken away to be raised by relatives, and Maria Eleonora was effectively pushed to the sidelines of the kingdom she had been queen of. And the daughter never forgave her, and never forgot. Christina grew up to be one of the most brilliant and unconventional monarchs in European history. The queen who filled her court with philosophers, who eventually abdicated her throne rather than marry, who scandalized the continent. And in her own later writings, she was cold and unsparing about her mother, remembering the smothering, theatrical grief, the darkened rooms, the sense of a woman more in love with mourning than with her own living child. Maria Eleonora had wanted a son so badly she could barely look at her daughter, and that daughter grew up to be one of the most remarkable women of the age and to regard her mother as an embarrassment. Her behavior grew so difficult that she was placed under what amounted to house arrest at a castle, her movements restricted, her role reduced to nothing. She hated it. She eventually fled Sweden entirely, escaping to Denmark and then to her native Germany. And for years, she was a queen in exile, largely cut off, a woman the Swedish establishment was quite happy to have out of sight and out of mind. For a time, the Swedish crown even stopped paying for her upkeep, washing its hands of her. When she finally returned to Sweden years later, her daughter Christina was grown, was queen in her own right, and the two of them were essentially strangers, with nothing left to say to each other. Maria Eleonora lived out her final years in a kind of hollow retirement, a dowager queen nobody needed, tolerated rather than loved. She died in 1655, having outlived her relevance by decades, a woman who had been so consumed by the loss of her husband that she lost her daughter, her position, and finally, her place in the story of her own country. She kept her husband's heart in a box above her bed. But the living daughter in that same bed grew up to barely know her and to write her off. Now let's leave Europe entirely, because this didn't only happen in the West. In some ways, the most complete erasure of a powerful woman in history happened in the Mughal Empire of India, to a woman who had, at her peak, effectively ruled a quarter of the world's population. Her name was Nur Jahan, and the distance she fell is almost impossible to comprehend. She was born to Persian nobles who had fallen on hard times, and there's a legend that as a baby, during her family's desperate journey to India, she was abandoned by the roadside because her parents were too poor to care for her, and then reclaimed. Whether or not that's true, she rose from difficult beginnings, was married young to a soldier, and was widowed. And then, in her 30s, considered well past youth by the standards of the age, she caught the eye of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, ruler of one of the richest empires on earth. He married her in 1611, and she became his 20th wife. And within a few years, this 20th wife had become the single most powerful person in the empire after the emperor himself, and arguably including him. Because Jahangir had a weakness. He was addicted to opium and alcohol, and he increasingly preferred pleasure to the exhausting business of ruling. And Nur Jahan was brilliant, politically shrewd, decisive, cultured, a poet and a markswoman who hunted tigers. So Jahangir simply let her run things. And she did. Coins were struck in her name, an almost unheard of honor for a woman, and a staggering statement of power in the Islamic world of the time. Imperial orders went out under her seal. Her name was joined with the emperor's in the official prayers. Foreign ambassadors understood that if you wanted something from the Mughal Empire, you went to Nur Jahan, not to the drug-clouded emperor. She designed gardens and buildings. She set fashions that swept the empire. She reformed trade, and she was fearless. There's a famous account of her on a hunting trip, killing 4 tigers with 6 shots from the back of an elephant, a feat the court poets celebrated for years. And when it came to it, she could fight. In 1626, when a rebellious general captured the emperor, it was Nur Jahan who mounted a war elephant, rode into the middle of the battle to try to rescue her husband, and kept directing the fight even as arrows struck the elephant around her, and one of her attendants was killed at her side. This was not a decorative consort. This was, for roughly 15 years, the functioning ruler of one of the richest and most populous empires on earth. And then Jahangir died in 1627, and it all came apart with breathtaking speed. Nur Jahan had been backing a particular candidate for the succession, and she lost. The winner was another of her relatives, Shah Jahan, the man who would go on to build the Taj Mahal. And Shah Jahan understood exactly how dangerous a woman like Nur Jahan could be. So he did not execute her, and he did not imprison her in chains. He did something quieter and, in a way, more total. He pensioned her off. He gave her a comfortable allowance and moved her out of power completely into a dignified, gilded, permanent retirement in Lahore. And there she simply disappeared from history. The woman whose name had been on the coinage, who had commanded armies and steered an empire, spent the last 18 years of her life in near total obscurity, out of politics, out of the story, quietly overseeing one project, the building of a tomb for her father and eventually for herself. She had ruled a quarter of humanity, and she spent almost 2 decades as a forgotten pensioner, watched but ignored, alive but erased. She designed her own tomb, and the inscription she is said to have chosen for it is one of the most haunting epitaphs any ruler ever wrote for herself. A request that on her grave there be no lamp and no flowers, so that neither the wings of moths would burn nor nightingales would sing. The most powerful woman in the world, asking to be left in the dark and the silence. She got her wish. For centuries, her tomb was neglected, and most people forgot she had ever existed at all. Every woman so far was erased by other people. Husbands, fathers, sons, rivals, courtiers, entire institutions built out of stone for the purpose. And in almost every case, they knew it was happening to them. Juana knew. Sophia Dorothea knew. Empress Wang called through the wall because she understood exactly where she was. The last woman on our list is the most haunting of all because she didn't. By the end, the person keeping her erased from reality was herself, and nobody ever told her the truth. This is the empress I mentioned at the start, in the castle, setting a place at dinner for a dead man. Her name was Carlotta, and she was born a princess of Belgium in 1840. Intelligent, beautiful, the cherished daughter of a king. At 17, she married for love, which almost none of these women got to do. Her husband was Maximilian, an Austrian archduke, the younger brother of the Habsburg emperor. They were well-matched and happy, and they had everything ahead of them. And then a catastrophic opportunity arrived. A group of Mexican conservatives, backed by the ambitions of Napoleon III of France, offered Maximilian a crown. "Come to Mexico," they said, "and rule as its emperor." It was a fantasy built on lies. They claimed the Mexican people wanted a European monarch, when in truth, the country was in the middle of a bitter struggle, and most Mexicans wanted nothing of the sort. But Maximilian and Carlotta, hungry for a purpose worthy of their blood, believed it. In 1864, they sailed to Mexico and were crowned emperor and empress. It was doomed from the start. They were foreign rulers imposed by French bayonets, opposed by the legitimate Republican government of Benito Juarez. And when the political winds shifted and Napoleon III decided Mexico wasn't worth it, he began pulling out his troops, leaving Maximilian and Carlotta stranded, propping up a throne with no army to defend it. Carlotta refused to accept defeat. In 1866, she made a desperate decision. She would sail back to Europe herself and personally beg the powerful men who had abandoned them to send help. And so began one of the most heartbreaking journeys in royal history. She crossed the ocean and went to Napoleon III, who had lured them into this, and pleaded with him, and he wept and refused. She went from court to court, and finally she went to Rome to beg the Pope himself. And in Rome, in the Vatican, Carlotta broke. She became convinced that people were trying to poison her. She refused to eat anything she hadn't seen prepared with her own eyes. At one point, she reportedly would only drink water drawn fresh in front of her from a public fountain and ate only nuts and oranges she could peel herself, or food taken straight from street vendors because anything served to her might be laced with poison. She was terrified and frantic and would not leave the Pope's side. She spent a night inside the Vatican, reportedly becoming the only woman ever to do so because she was too afraid to sleep anywhere else. She clung to the Pope's hand. She wept and raved about assassins. Her mind, under the unbearable weight of the failing empire and the abandonment and the fear, simply gave way. Over the course of a few weeks, a poised, brilliant 26-year-old empress dissolved into a frightened woman who trusted no one and nothing. Her family came and collected her and brought her back to Europe to be cared for. And while she was descending into that darkness on the other side of the ocean, the end came for Maximilian. The Republicans captured him, and in June 1867, he was stood against a wall on a hill outside Querétaro and executed by firing squad. His last words were reportedly a wish that his blood might be the last spilled for Mexico. Carlotta was 26 years old, and she had another 60 years left to live. She never recovered. She was declared insane, and she was placed in seclusion, first in Italy, then finally in Bouchou Castle, near Brussels, in Belgium. And there she stayed, cared for, guarded, hidden away, for the rest of an extraordinarily long life. And there is real debate, even now, about how much of her long madness was genuine illness and how much was a convenient diagnosis that kept an inconvenient, potentially claim-bearing royal woman safely out of the way. A gilded cage justified by a doctor's word, exactly as it had been for Juana 3.5 centuries before. And the world simply went on without her. Think about what passed by outside those castle walls while Carlotta sat inside them, frozen in 1867. She had left Mexico at 26. She died at 86. In between, the telephone was invented, the automobile, the airplane. The First World War was fought and won and mourned. Entire dynasties that had been standing when she went into the castle collapsed while she was in there. She outlived the fall of the Bonapartes in France, the Braganzas in Brazil, the Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollerns in Germany, and her husband's own family, the Habsburgs in Austria. She watched from inside her own erasure the entire world of European monarchy that she'd been born into crumble and disappear. And she never fully understood that any of it was happening. Because inside the castle, it was always the empire. She reportedly still spoke of Maximilian as though he were alive, or as though his death were a fresh and confusing rumor she'd never been properly told the truth of. She held on to her title. She played with dolls, some accounts say, and held court with imaginary attendants, and had drifted through her own private, permanent 1867. She was, in her own mind, still the Empress of Mexico, waiting. Curiously, as she aged, the paranoia that had gripped her in Rome seemed to soften, and her final years were reportedly calmer. She is said to have thought often and gently of her husband and their brief happiness, right up to the end. There's one detail that captures the strange, sad dignity of it. When the German army invaded Belgium in 1914 and occupied the region around her castle, a German officer, learning who lived inside, reportedly posted a notice at her gate, instructing the soldiers to pass by quietly and leave this place untouched out of respect for Her Majesty, the Empress of Mexico, sister-in-law of the Austrian emperor who was Germany's ally. An empire that had never really taken root, ruled by an empress the world had forgotten, was alive, protected for one more moment by soldiers in a war she would never comprehend, in the name of a family alliance she'd been part of half a century before. She died in that castle in January 1927, at the age of 86, still, in her own mind, an empress, still holding on to a husband 60 years in his grave. She had been forgotten before she died so completely that when she finally did die, much of the world was surprised to learn she'd still been alive at all, a living relic of a vanished century who had outlasted the entire world that made her. So look at what these women have in common, because it's the thread that ties all of them together across 5 centuries and half the globe. A teenage queen, exiled and dead at 23, torn from her babies. A 14-year-old bride, abandoned 2 days after her wedding and murdered in a southern fortress. A woman locked in a moated castle for 32 years, made queen of a country she was never allowed to enter. Imperial sisters shelved in convents and dragged back out like furniture when the empire ran short of men. A slave-born woman who corresponded with Queen Elizabeth and ran an empire's foreign policy, packed off to a building the Ottomans kept specifically for women who no longer counted. An Empress of China sealed into a bricked-up room, calling through a hole in the wall just to see the sun again. A sane woman called Mad and buried alive for 46 years by her own father and son. A widow with her husband's heart in a box, pushed out of her own kingdom. An empress who ruled a quarter of the world, pensioned into silence and asking for a grave with no lamp and no flowers. And an empress who spent 60 years in a castle, ruling a country that no longer existed. These are not 10 pieces of bad luck. Look at what these societies actually built. Byzantium had the convent. China had the cold palace. The Ottomans had the old palace. Germany had the moated castle in the forest. Spain had a fortress at Tordesillas and a word, madness, that worked just as well as any wall. Every one of these civilizations, independently, on different continents, in different centuries, arrived at the same answer to the same question. What do you do with a royal woman who is no longer useful but is still alive? And they all said, put her somewhere and agree to stop thinking about her. It wasn't cruelty in the heat of the moment, it was infrastructure. Somebody drew up the plans, allocated the budget, assigned the guards, set the food allowance. The erasure of inconvenient women was a line item. And that's the part that stays with me. Not one of these women died and was slowly forgotten the way the rest of us will be. Every one of them was erased on purpose, while she was still alive to feel it, turned into a ghost while her heart was still beating, and then left in the silence to haunt her own life. The world forgot they were alive, but they never got to forget. They remembered exactly who they had been every single day, right up until the end. And being the last person alive who still remembers you mattered. That might be the loneliest thing that can happen to anyone.